In the 20th century, the world went through incredible changes, and against this background, a huge number of secret projects developed by various states remained in the shadows. These projects often had nothing to do with ordinary science or research work, but were the fruit of deep political and military strategies. Participation in such projects was strictly limited, and it was only decades later that the public began to learn about some of them. We will try to restore the chronicle of the most famous and most mysterious of them, opening up new pages of history that you may not have known about. One of the most famous and controversial projects related to secret science and military equipment is, of course, the Manhattan Project. Although his name became synonymous with one of the greatest scientific developments in human history, the very concept of creating an atomic bomb remained completely classified until the very end of World War II. It was a project in which scientists, engineers, and the military began working in the United States to develop weapons of mass destruction based on a nuclear reaction. Similar work was carried out by other countries, but it was the American project that proved to be the most successful. The most prominent scientists of that time became the main link in this project. Among them was Robert Oppenheimer, who became known as the father of the atomic bomb. In addition to scientific efforts, the Manhattan Project was closely guarded and millions of dollars were invested in its development. Experimental work was carried out in the most secret places, such as Los Alamos in New Mexico, where a laboratory was built, which brought together the leading minds of the time. And so, on July 16, 1945, the first successful nuclear explosion was carried out in the New Mexico desert, which marked the beginning of a new era in the military and political world. However, it was not only the United States that conducted secret research in the framework of nuclear technology. The Soviet Union, despite its ideological isolation and limited resources, also began its own work on the creation of atomic weapons. Just a few years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, which proved shocking to the Western world and changed the political landscape during the Cold War. In addition to atomic research, other secret projects were conducted in the 20th century, which remained in the shadows for many years. So, one of these projects was related to space research. After the Soviet Union sent the first satellite into orbit in 1957, the world's space race began. However, few people knew that at the same time, work was underway to create so-called black projects related to secret military satellites and research in the field of space weapons. One of these projects was Corona, an American reconnaissance satellite program that began operating back in the 1950s. These satellites made it possible to take photographs of the Earth from space, which were used for reconnaissance purposes before this information became available to the general public. The most exciting of these projects was the creation of technologies for space flights and space satellites with the possibility of using them for military purposes. The X-15 project, which was developed in the 1950s, allowed the United States to create the world's first manned space aircraft that could reach space heights and perform reconnaissance missions. It was one of the most ambitious and secret projects of its time. The Soviet Union also kept up and developed its space programs. One of the most mysterious projects was the Luna program, which created rockets to deliver payloads to the moon. However, beyond the public achievements such as the first launch of an artificial satellite and the first human spaceflight, there were other equally important but hidden developments. One of these projects was the secret Lunar Code, which included attempts to land not only automatic vehicles on the moon, but also manned spacecraft, the use of which remained hidden from Western countries. These projects were so secret that even in recent decades, despite the discovery of archives, little is known about the real goals and outcomes of these missions. But it wasn't just military and space projects that remained hidden in the 20th century. Some of the most interesting and creepy programs were conducted as part of scientific research and experiments on humans. One of the most famous such projects was the MK Ultra project, which was carried out in the USA in the 1950s and 60s. It was a secret project of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the purpose of which was to research and develop methods of mind control and mind manipulation using psychotropic substances. Various drugs, including LSD, were used in the experiments, and thousands of people became unwitting participants in these studies. Many of these people did not even know that they had been subjected to medical experiments, and it was only decades later that the details of these terrible experiences became known. Such secret projects conducted by governments of different countries raise questions about the morality and legality of using new technologies, as well as what boundaries should exist between scientific research and ethical standards. These issues remain relevant to this day, and even today, many secret projects and research remain hidden from the general public. The MK Ultra project was just the tip of the iceberg in a world of secret research that straddled science, ethics, and human rights. This project, moving along the path of mind manipulation, was one of the darkest and most controversial in the history of the CIA. Unlike military and space projects, its goals and methods were aimed at destroying a person's inner world, changing his perception of reality, and even manipulating personal will. Within the framework of MK Ultra, many experiments were conducted using LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other mind control methods. The purpose of the program was not only to study methods of psychocontrol, but also to create new weapons that could be used in intelligence, political influence, and manipulation of the masses. In one of the most famous episodes of the program, the participants in the experiments took LSD without their knowledge in order to assess its effect on the psyche and a person's ability to self-determination. In some cases, people lost contact with reality, experiencing psychosis and constant hallucinations, which led to long-term psychological trauma. Even more terrifyingly, the CIA used MK Ultra not only on willing participants, but also on people who were not asked for consent. These experiments continued for several decades, and even after the project was officially closed in 1973, its effects were felt for a long time. This was one of the reasons why later they began to publicly discuss restrictions on the use of psychotropic substances for scientific purposes, as well as the need to regulate human experiments. One of the other key secret projects of the 20th century that had a huge impact on the course of history was the Star Wars project, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. It was a project initiated by President Ronald Reagan in 1983 at the height of the Cold War. The SOI was tasked with creating a missile defense system that would intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at the United States before they could reach their target. Although the project was announced publicly in 1983, it had many secret aspects related to new technologies in the field of lasers, satellite systems, and anti-rocket missiles. Officially, SDI was announced as a system of protection against nuclear attacks. But many researchers and analysts believe that it was an attempt to create an invisible, high-tech, defensive system that could completely change the strategic balance in the world. The desire to create high-tech defense systems has become part of the growing tension between the two superpowers. The SDI was never fully implemented, and much of the work was curtailed after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. However, within the framework of this project, some new technologies were developed, which later became the basis for modern satellite surveillance systems and other early warning tools. Another mysterious project that still raises many questions and debates is the Rainbow Program, better known as the Philadelphia Experiment. In 1943, the U.S. Navy allegedly conducted an experiment on ship invisibility using advanced technologies that could distort or obliterate the space around the object. The goal of the project was to make the ship invisible to enemy radars. According to one version of events, an experiment was conducted on the USS Eldridge destroyer in Philadelphia Bay based on this technology. The experiment, according to the participants, led to unexplained consequences. The ship allegedly disappeared from radar and into space, and then returned a few minutes later, but with serious abnormal effects, such as severe burns and mental disorders among the crew members. Although the project was officially refuted, many point to the anomalous incidents that occurred during that period as evidence that the experiment actually took place. According to conspiracy theorists, this was only the first step towards the development of new technologies, which were supposed to lead to the creation of completely new types of weapons and means of protection, using which it would be possible to control not only physical space, but also the perception of reality. Programs to create new types of weapons and technologies for their use were far from limited to nuclear or space technology. Biological and chemical research played an important role in secret research. For decades, governments of different countries have been developing and using biological weapons. In the United States, for example, a project codenamed Cypher was conducted, which was aimed at creating viruses and bacteria capable of causing epidemics among enemies, while they had to be so dangerous that they could not be cured with existing medicines. Special attention was paid to the development of anthrax, and other agents that could be used as biological weapons. These experiments were conducted in the most classified laboratories, such as Los Alamos, and were disguised as scientific research in the field of medicine and pharmaceuticals. The secrecy of these projects was so great that they continued even after the signing of international agreements banning biological weapons in 1975. Secret developments were not limited to hostile states. In many projects, governments have used their own citizens to test new chemical and biological agents. One such example is the Typhoon project in the Soviet Union, in which experiments with biological weapons were conducted on random residents of labor camps. In the 20th century, experiments related to psychology, human behavior, and mass communications were also conducted. For example, the Times project is a secret study of the influence of various media on public opinion. These experiments explored how different types of advertising, propaganda, and disinformation can influence the behavior of the masses. In the 1960s, the United States used these studies to develop methods of influencing the political and social stability of other countries, using the media as a weapon. It is also necessary to mention experimental work related to radiation and the effects of high doses of radiation on living organisms. These experiments were conducted in various countries, and often the participants in these studies were unaware of the risks they were exposed to. In particular, in the 1950s, the United States conducted secret tests that used people in radiation-contaminated areas to study how different doses of radiation could affect health. The 20th century was a time when scientific and military research were intertwined with morality and human rights. Secret projects carried out in the shadow of major political conflicts show how far states can go in their efforts to create weapons and technologies that can change the course of history. Many such projects remained classified, and information about them was often revealed only decades later. Nevertheless, their influence on world politics, science, and even everyday life is still being felt. The Germany 100 Project. Scientific research of the Third Reich. One of the most mysterious and interesting secret projects that remained in the shadows for many years was the development of Nazi Germany in the field of missile technology, as well as work on the creation of new types of weapons, including supersonic aircraft and combat devices. The program, dubbed Germany 100, was one of the most ambitious attempts to create a weapon of victory for the Nazi regime. The most famous element of this project was the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile capable of delivering payloads. The program, organized by Wernher von Braun, created the basis for further rocket research, which years later became the basis of the space programs of the United States and the Soviet Union. However, despite the public recognition of the achievements of German scientists in rocket technology, secret developments in the field of biological and chemical research were no less important. According to some historians, Germany actively explored the possibility of creating biological weapons, using substances such as anthrax, smallpox, and other deadly bacteria to use them as mass weapons of destruction. These works were carried out at closed military bases, including on the territory of occupied countries. The expected results from these experiments were never achieved, but many scientists and experts were involved in the work, many of whom were later transported to the United States and the Soviet Union as part of Operations Papa, Paperclip, and Operation Shadow Fist. The New Era Project and Guided Weapons. In the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, active work began on the creation of technology-controlled systems designed to change the strategic balance of power. It was not only a military project, but also an attempt to advance in the field of the latest technologies to suppress the enemy at the level of psychological impact. The New Era project was focused on creating new types of weapons with the possibility of not only automatic, but also remote control, which made it possible to change the rules of engagement. One of these technologies is a rocket with high-precision guided guidance systems. Initially, these missiles were designed for use in military conflict zones, but it soon became clear that their potential could also be used to create new, more flexible methods of influencing the enemy. So, already in the 1970s, the project developed several prototypes of tactical missiles capable of detonating within a certain radius of the target. These missiles had the ability to change the direction of flight depending on the changing situation on the battlefield and could be equipped with neural interfaces that allowed operators to remotely control each element of the explosive device. The secrecy of the project lay in the fact that for decades the United States and the Soviet Union had been hiding information about developments in the field of psychotronic weapons, which were supposed to affect the enemy's nervous system, reducing its combat capability. These developments later became the basis for the creation of radar weapon systems that affect the human nervous system, and, importantly, for the use of new, experimental biorobots for military purposes. The Soviet Project Greenleaf experiments with genetic weapons. In the 1960s and 1970s, secret research in the field of biotechnology was also conducted in the Soviet Union, including in the context of creating weapons capable of affecting the genetic makeup of humans. One of the most secret projects in this area was the Greenleaf Project, which lasted from the early 1960s to the late 1980s. The goal of the project was to develop drugs and technologies capable of changing the genetic code of living beings, including humans, as soon as possible, and also applying these changes to create ideal soldiers with enhanced physical and mental abilities. The program actively used genetic engineering methods and experimented with the effects of various chemical and biological substances on living organisms. Among the tasks of the project was also the creation of genetic modifications that would make it possible to infect enemy armies with a high probability using specially grown microorganisms resistant to antibiotics. In addition, within the framework of the project, work was underway to create drugs that could affect the human psyche, creating so-called medical weapons that were supposed to suppress the morale of the enemy and reduce his ability to resist. There are mentions of the development of drugs for mass infection of the population, for example, the creation of bacteriophages that could infect large groups of people, cause mass epidemics, and then disappear to create panic. The project was closed in the late 1980s, but its impact was felt for several decades after its completion. Modern biotechnologies, to some extent, continue to follow the directions that were initiated as part of these secret works. The Charlie Project, anti-gravity research, and parallel realities. One of the most mysterious and mystical projects carried out in the 20th century was the Charlie Project, which was a series of anti-gravity and experimental studies. This project was mainly aimed at exploring the possibilities of creating devices capable of neutralizing gravity, as well as manipulating space-time. Officially, the Charlie Project did not exist, and many researchers consider it a figment of conspiracy theorists' imagination. However, there is evidence indicating that work in the field of anti-gravity was carried out as part of military and scientific research. Based on the available data, the Charlie Project began to be implemented in the mid-1950s in several countries, including the USA, the Soviet Union, and Germany. His goal was to create aircraft that could travel without using traditional fuel, which would make them invulnerable to missiles and radar. Within the framework of this project, research was conducted in the field of creating anti-gravity devices, such as the so-called flying saucers. And there were several successful tests, but there is practically no information about them. Many believe that these studies were related to the possibility of creating not only new aircraft, but also research related to travel to parallel realities or time. The project assumed that gravity manipulation could create doors to other dimensions. These studies have become the basis for a number of other more recent studies in the field of theoretical physics and quantum technologies, which are currently under active development. Space programs and secret expeditions. Secrets of the Moon and Mars. One of the biggest secrets of the Cold War remained the space research conducted by the United States and the Soviet Union, which, according to many sources, was not limited to flights to the moon. Despite the fact that the Apollo missions have become world famous, there is a version that NASA conducted additional missions as part of covert operations, the purpose of which was to explore not only the moon, but also other objects of the solar system, including Mars. According to some theories, already in the 1960s, American scientists developed several experimental ships that used the capabilities of anti-gravity technologies, which allowed them not only to reach the moon, but also to travel longer distances. During these expeditions, discoveries were allegedly made that were not published in open sources and were kept strictly secret. Secret records and data on Martian exploration have begun to appear in recent decades. and more scientists believe that the first successful landings on Mars were carried out much earlier than was officially announced. Although today scientists are still arguing about what was actually discovered on Mars, many claim that in the early 70s, the USSR and the USA conducted several successful manned expeditions to Mars, which were subsequently hidden from the public. Vulcan Project, underground bases and the development of hidden technologies. Another little, known but extremely interesting project related to military and scientific research is the Volcano Project. Within its framework, various governments, including the United States and the USSR, actively worked to create hidden underground bases that could serve as shelters in the event of a nuclear war. These bases were also intended for the hidden storage of technologies and equipment that were supposed to remain out of sight of the outside world. The Volcano Project was started in the 1960s and continued until the end of the 1980s. The peculiarity of this project was that its participants explored the possibility of creating safe shelters deep underground that could withstand the effects of a nuclear explosion. As part of the project, work was underway to create new materials and structures that were supposed to provide maximum protection from radiation and other dangerous factors. In addition, work was underway in these underground bases to create high-tech systems, such as computers, that could operate in conditions that would exclude the possibility of their detection. The project also explored ways to create closed ecosystems that would allow people to stay underground for a long time without experiencing oxygen and food shortages. One of the most famous examples of hidden underground facilities is the Powers Project, which was initiated by the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies in the 1960s. This project was aimed at creating underground facilities for testing nuclear weapons, as well as for use as a place to store secret documents and technologies that were supposed to remain hidden. The giant project, Global Surveillance Systems. In the 1960s and 70s, the development of secret programs related to global satellite systems for monitoring military and political events in other countries began. The giant project became an important element of the Cold War, allowing intelligence agencies to monitor enemy activity and carry out strategic planning. The project was secret and included the creation of satellites for radar, as well as the installation of remote sensors that could detect not only changes in the atmosphere, but also the movements of armies and ships. The use of such technologies became an important part of the conduct of the Cold War, allowing the governments of the United States and the USSR to control not only what was happening on Earth, but also in space. One of the most striking examples of the use of global observation systems in the framework of the Giant Project was the launch in the 1970s of satellites designed to detect underwater nuclear explosions. These satellites had the ability to detect even the slightest changes in the chemical composition of the atmosphere, which made it possible to detect any explosions associated with nuclear weapons tests. It is expected that the giant satellites continued to operate until the end of the 1980s, and then were decommissioned due to technology obsolescence. The Giant Project became the basis for the creation of further monitoring and intelligence systems, which in the future will be used as part of global operations to combat terrorism, monitor environmental changes, and monitor nuclear tests. The Black Dolphin Project, psychological manipulation and mind control. In the 1980s and 1990s, the United States and the Soviet Union actively worked not only on new military technologies, but also on methods of psychological influence. One of these secret projects was the Black Dolphin Project, which included research and experiments aimed at manipulating personality and controlling mass consciousness. The name of the project is associated with its high secrecy and the use of new psychological methods in intelligence-gathering operations. The project included developments in the field of medical weapons, aimed at changing the perception of reality and subjugating people through influencing their psyche. The work was carried out using psychotropic substances, hypnosis, and new data processing methods, which later became the basis for the creation of so-called psychological wars. One of the most famous aspects of the Black Dolphin Project was the experiments conducted on prisoners in prisons in order to study methods of mind manipulation and the destruction of personal will. It was expected that these studies would create new ways to influence the enemy through the use of psychological attacks. Golden Light Project, artificial intelligence and computer management. The Golden Light program was one of the first projects that used the basic principles of artificial intelligence to create technologies for controlling military systems. These studies began in the 1950s and 60s and continued until the late 1990s. Although the project was hidden within the framework of military development, its influence on the development of computer technology is still felt to this day. The project was aimed at creating the first intelligent systems capable of self-learning and decision-making without human intervention. It was expected that these systems would be able to manage complex military operations and analyze large amounts of data, which would significantly increase the effectiveness of military strategies and operations in the future. The secrecy of the project lay in the fact that its research was carried out within the framework of military laboratories, where the most advanced scientists in the field of computing and mathematics worked. Despite the fact that the project was closed in the late 1990s, it became the basis for many modern artificial intelligence technologies, including control systems for robots and autonomous military devices. Mir 2025 Project: Development of Global Climate Technologies. Programmatic research on global climate change and environmental impacts has become an important element of secret programs of the 20th century. One of these projects, Mir 2025, was aimed at creating technologies that could make it possible to manage the climate on a global level. This included manipulating the weather, changing ocean currents, and even creating new technologies to combat global environmental disasters. The project was hidden because of its global ambition and the high risks that could be associated with the possible consequences of such technologies. One of the research areas was the creation of artificial clouds to control precipitation in arid regions and to change air circulation to prevent severe hurricanes and storms. Conclusion: the legacy of secret projects. The secret projects of the 20th century formed the basis for many modern technologies and scientific achievements, some of which are becoming more accessible and understandable to the public. However, this does not mean that all the secrets have been revealed. Not all developments related to nuclear energy, psychology, biology, weapons, and space have been fully disclosed. Many of these projects not only showed how far governments can go in their efforts to create new technologies, but also reminded of the importance of moral and ethical standards in scientific research. The discoveries made in the framework of these studies have radically changed the world, but they have left behind many mysteries that may continue to influence the future of humanity. Their memory, as well as hidden archives, are still waiting for their full disclosure, and we may only be beginning to understand how far such experiments can go and what unpredictable consequences they may entail.